Our suitcases clattered along the stone path leading to Paul's house. Sarah dashed ahead while I walked slowly, taking in the sight of the grand building before me. The house was impressive yet inviting. Perfectly painted walls, a neatly trimmed lawn, and large windows draped with soft curtains. It all looked like the picture-perfect family home straight from a magazine. "Mom, hurry up!" Sarah called out from the porch, her voice filled with impatience. Paul came out to greet us, looking as impeccable as ever. His smile was broad, like a host welcoming cherished guests. But something in his gaze made me pause for a second. It wasn't just the warmth of a welcoming homeowner. "Amelia, Sarah, welcome. I hope you'll feel comfortable here," he said as he stepped forward and hugged Sarah with a warmth that felt just a bit excessive. I nodded briefly, feeling the tension in my shoulders. When I stepped inside, I involuntarily held my breath. The spacious rooms were bathed in soft light, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air with coziness. Paul had clearly put effort into making everything feel inviting. Sarah immediately ran off to explore the rooms, leaving me alone in the entryway. "Make yourself at home, Amelia." Paul's voice came from behind, uncomfortably close. I turned around and met his calm but intent gaze. It lingered just a second too long, and I quickly stepped aside, hoping to hide my sudden discomfort. Dinner went by without incident, though I felt Paul's eyes on me throughout. His gaze seemed to search for something I couldn't quite understand. Sarah chattered happily about her plans for the next day, oblivious to the tension. I forced a smile, playing the part of the attentive mother, though a sense of unease was steadily growing within me. Later that evening, I headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the soft glow of a nightlight. Suddenly, I felt a light touch on my shoulder. "You're settling in quickly," Paul said softly, leaning in slightly. His hand rested gently on my shoulder, but I could feel its weight. A chill ran down my spine. I stood still, unsure of how to respond. The silence between us thickened with unspoken tension. Paul smiled unexpectedly, withdrew his hand, and walked away, leaving me alone in the quiet hallway. The morning began with the soft creak of floorboards and the rustling of newspaper pages. Sarah was already busy with her tasks, her laughter drifting from the kitchen and filling the house with life. I sat on the terrace with a cup of coffee, listening to those sounds, yet I felt like an outsider observing someone else's world. Paul appeared again. He moved so quietly that his presence startled me. His footsteps were barely audible, but his attention felt palpable. From the corner of my eye, I saw him settle into the chair across from me. He watched me for a few seconds over his cup before his gaze drifted to my hands. Sarah had fully immersed herself in the rhythm of the house, eagerly helping Paul with everything and discussing plans as if they shared ownership of this place. I, however, noticed that I was always alone when he appeared. In the afternoon, the doorbell interrupted my thoughts. Jake stood at the door with a slight smile and a pack of muffins, his way of showing support. We exchanged a brief look without words. He stepped inside and headed to the terrace as though he already knew the way. "You look tired." His voice was soft, but I could tell from his expression that he was worried. I nodded and sank into the wicker chair beside him. For a moment, I felt at ease. Jake had a way of making everything seem okay, if only for a short while. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the breeze and the rustle of leaves, while the sounds from the kitchen reminded me that the house had a life of its own. After Jake left, the quiet returned, filling the space. I paused by the window, staring at my reflection as though trying to understand something. Footsteps sounded behind me. Paul stopped nearby, close enough for me to catch the scent of his cologne. He lingered for a moment before quietly saying, "You should feel at home." His words were simple, yet carried a weight that felt like a challenge. I was left standing alone, the air around me suddenly heavier. The evening with friends was supposed to distract me from the thoughts that had settled in my mind after the move. We gathered at a small, cozy cafe where the soft light of the lamps created a warm, inviting atmosphere. Jake sat across from me, telling yet another funny story. But his words seemed to pass right through me. I smiled and nodded, but fragments of scenes with Paul kept spinning in my head. His lingering gaze, his sudden appearances, and that strange moment on the terrace. "Amelia, are you listening?" Jake's voice brought me back to reality. "Sorry, I was just lost in thought," I replied quickly, taking a sip of coffee to hide my embarrassment. The evening felt endless. Instead of relaxing, I was tense the whole time, as if I was being watched even from a distance. When I returned home, the clock showed past midnight. The house was silent, and only the dim glow of a desk lamp spilled through the living room door. I was about to head upstairs when I heard a muffled voice. Paul was talking on the phone. I froze, listening. "Yes, Amelia?" He said my name as though it meant more than just a mention. The rest of the words were too quiet to make out. A chill ran down my spine. Why was he discussing me on the phone? I took a cautious step back and climbed the stairs, trying to shake off the oppressive thoughts. In the morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh bread and frying bacon. When I went downstairs, I saw Paul in the kitchen. He was wearing a t-shirt with rolled-up sleeves, looking relaxed and confident. Plates of food were set on the table, and the kettle was whistling nearby. "Good morning," he greeted me with a smile. "I figured I'd make something to brighten your morning." I nodded, feeling slightly uneasy. He set down the knife and turned toward me. "Shorts and an off-shoulder top. You definitely know how to make breakfast interesting." His words sounded like a compliment, but I didn't know how to respond. Inside, I felt a mixture of embarrassment and something more, an unsettling pull toward the attention he was giving me. I pretended not to notice the subtext, but my heart was beating faster. I sat down and took a bite of toast, but my thoughts kept circling back to his gaze and his calm tone. What started as a simple breakfast was slowly becoming something much more complicated. The morning was cold, so I chose a cozy sweater and a warm skirt. When I went down to the kitchen, Paul was already cooking. The smell of toasted bread filled the air. A basket of vegetables sat on the counter, and I leaned over to grab a bell pepper. "You definitely know how to draw attention," his calm voice came from behind. "It's impossible not to stare at your stockings and skirt when you bend down." I froze for a moment, as if Paul's words had cut through the air between us. Heat rushed to my cheeks. I straightened and turned to meet his gaze. There was no embarrassment in his eyes, no attempt to take back what he'd said. "Maybe you should focus less on vegetables, Paul," I said with feigned lightness, trying to turn it into a joke. But even that smile couldn't hide my discomfort. The silence returned, broken only by the sound of bread sizzling in the pan. Paul slowly turned away, as if this were just a normal conversation. But I could still feel his gaze lingering. The rest of the day passed on autopilot. Sarah left to visit a friend, and I busied myself with chores, but the strange feeling of Paul's presence never left me. He would appear in the room briefly without a word, but each time I caught his glance, brief but charged, as if the conversation in the kitchen was unfinished. By evening, Jake arrived. His warm smile and energetic voice filled the house with life and a familiar comfort. He hugged me and brought a box of fresh pastries, for the mood, as he liked to say. "You've made yourself a lovely place here," he said, glancing around. "This house feels like it was made to be filled with light and warmth." I nodded, smiling, but my attention kept drifting to Paul, who sat in the corner of the room with a book in hand. He looked completely at ease, yet his presence felt like a shadow, as if he were observing every move I made, even without lifting his eyes from the page. Jake and I spent the evening on the terrace, cups of coffee warming our hands as we discussed the plans for the week. It was always easy with Jake, but I couldn't fully relax. A strange weight pressed on my shoulders, the sense of being watched. When Jake stood to leave, I walked him to the door. Paul stood and walked past us toward the living room. For a moment, he turned and nodded at me, his smile faint and barely noticeable. It was an ordinary gesture, but I felt that it carried something personal. Jake didn't notice, but I lingered by the door, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps down the hall. Everything seemed innocent, yet the boundaries I'd carefully built were slowly beginning to blur. The noise of the party filled the air. Music blended with laughter and quiet conversations. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of drinks and perfume. I stood near the bar, holding a cocktail in my hand, watching the flashing lights reflect off the glass. The evening seemed carefree and lighthearted, but inside the tension remained, a weight that no music or laughter could lift. Jake was laughing and telling stories, gesturing in his usual animated way. It was familiar, comforting even, something that always made me feel at ease. Yet his presence couldn't chase away my thoughts about Paul. His compliments, the lingering gaze, the subtle touches, they all replayed in my mind like echoes. I tried convincing myself it was nothing but my imagination, yet my body seemed to remember every second. When the dancing wore me out, I sank into the couch and closed my eyes, letting the noise fade into the background. Snippets of Paul's words resurfaced as if whispered again and again. My name and his voice felt vivid, even amid the hum of the party. A strange warmth settled in my chest, impossible to explain. Time passed in a blur. When I stepped outside to cool down, the cold air stung my skin. The night was dark but not unsettling. The streetlights cast a soft glow over the sidewalk, illuminating the quiet path. I arrived home past midnight. The house greeted me with silence and emptiness. I carefully shut the door and slipped off my shoes to avoid waking Sarah. But as I moved toward the kitchen, I noticed the light was on. Paul sat at the table, his half-empty cup of tea resting in front of him. A few stray drops clung to the rim. He didn't react at first, but when he finally looked up, his calm demeanor felt heavy, as though hiding something beneath its surface. His eyes locked onto mine, steady and unreadable. My heartbeat quickened. He ran a finger along the edge of the cup and glanced at the clock but didn't speak right away. The silence felt more powerful than words. I walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and filled a glass with water. The sound of the running water briefly broke the silence. When I turned back, Paul was watching me, his head tilted slightly as though studying me. His silence was like a wall I couldn't break through. His voice came just as I was about to leave, low, calm, and devoid of obvious emotion. "Sit down. We need to talk." The words sounded both like an invitation and a warning. I froze for a moment, standing at a crossroads, as the room seemed to shrink around us, leaving only the two of us in its quiet center. The house was wrapped in silence. Even the sounds from outside felt distant and muffled. Paul stood by the window, staring out with a contemplative stillness. His calm appearance seemed ordinary, but there was something beneath the surface, something tense, ready to break free. I stepped into the kitchen, unease building with every step. I wanted to pass through unnoticed, but the weight of his gaze already held me in place. Slowly, he turned, and I knew there was no avoiding what was coming. He moved closer, each step deliberate, soft, yet charged with something unspoken. The space between us narrowed until it felt like none remained. His eyes traced over me as though seeing something I couldn't comprehend myself. His hand lifted gently to my chin, tilting my face up toward his. The touch was warm but firm, filled with quiet certainty. I held my breath as the seconds stretched out. The world shrank to this single moment. His lips met mine without warning. It wasn't a question or a request. It was simply a fact. There was no hesitation in the kiss. Heat rushed through my body, my chest tightening under the weight of emotion. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. For a few seconds, I stayed in that overwhelming pull until reality burst through the haze. I stepped back abruptly, as though I'd finally understood what had happened. The air felt sharp and cold, and something inside me felt like it had broken free. This shouldn't have happened. Everything was going wrong. Paul stood there, his breathing steady, his expression calm. There was something unsettling about his composure, as if he had known all along and was merely waiting for this moment. I could still feel the imprint of his touch, lingering on my skin like a mark left behind. I wanted to forget everything that happened in the kitchen, erase that moment, wipe it from my memory like a random mistake. But the harder I tried to push the memories away, the deeper they took root. To silence the noise in my head, I spent more time with Jake. His presence always restored a sense of stability and safety, as if I could hide from my own anxiety behind his broad shoulders. We planned a quiet evening at his place, the warm glow of table lamps, a soft blanket on the couch, and mugs of hot tea with the cozy scent of cinnamon. Jake put on soft music and, sitting beside me, gently placed his hand on my shoulder. His touch was careful, as though he was afraid of touching something fragile. "You don't need to explain anything," he said, his voice so soft that for a second I wanted to believe everything could be simple again. I closed my eyes and leaned into his shoulder. My heartbeat was steady, calm, but something inside still felt broken. Jake didn't ask questions. He just pulled me closer, as if trying to piece together my scattered fragments with his hands. The night outside wrapped the city in darkness, muffling its usual noise, but inside the room there was a quiet stillness, a living, comforting silence. His breath and warmth made it easier to relax, though images still flickered at the edges of my mind. When he pressed his lips to my temple, a memory of another touch, sharp and forbidden, flashed before my eyes. I opened my eyes suddenly as if waking from a dream. Jake didn't notice. His gaze was filled with care and tenderness. He looked at me as if I was his whole world, and I wanted to respond with the same sincerity, but instead a growing emptiness spread through me. Everything he did for me, his hands, his whispers, his gentle touch, felt right, but didn't stir the kind of excitement I should have felt. Instead, guilt grew for the spark that ignited inside me when I thought of Paul. When I returned home, the house was steeped in darkness. In my room, I was greeted by my own reflection in the mirror. I stared at my face and saw more than just tiredness. There was something else, indecision, confusion, the shadow of something I couldn't explain. Why is this happening to me? I thought, finding no answer in my reflection or my own thoughts. The weekend brought a rare calm to the house. Sarah spent the morning fussing over books and playing with the cat that had shown up at the neighbors and now became her new favorite. I tried to focus on reading, but my thoughts wandered, circling back to recent events no matter how much I resisted. By evening, Paul came out of his room and suggested a movie night. A family evening. Sarah immediately lit up at the idea and started scrolling through the movie list. There was nothing I could do but agree and try to maintain a sense of normalcy. We settled in the living room, soft pillows, a warm blanket, and the flickering light of the screen. Sarah sat with a smile, comfortably curled up in the armchair, happily commenting on the opening scenes. Her carefree attitude made the evening almost ordinary, almost. Paul sat nearby, closer than I would have liked. His presence seemed to fill the space between us. I tried to focus on the film's plot, but every time I instinctively turned my head, I caught his gaze. It wasn't intrusive, more attentive, as though he was observing me, searching for something in my reactions. My heart tightened with conflicting emotions, a blend of tension and shame at how hard it was to remain indifferent. At one point, I found myself counting the minutes until the movie ended. Sarah's laughter echoed in the room, bright, sincere, like someone who didn't suspect anything. That laughter amplified my guilt, as though this unspoken secret was growing too large to contain. When the movie ended, Sarah stretched and walked upstairs with a satisfied smile. "Good night," she called cheerfully. I followed her, feeling drained from trying to suppress my own emotions. As I reached the top of the stairs, Paul stepped into the hallway, standing just a few steps behind me. His voice was soft, but there was something ambiguous in it. "Sweet dreams, Amelia." I paused but didn't turn around. His words reverberated inside me like a quiet toll of a bell. I continued down the hall, feeling his gaze on my back, and closed the bedroom door behind me as if it could restore a sense of boundaries. But even in my room, the silence echoed with his parting words, as if they carried more weight than just a simple farewell. I settled on the bed, surrounded by pillows, with my laptop resting on my lap. Jake's familiar face on the screen made it feel like, for a moment, all my worries had disappeared. His usual expressions, soft smile and steady voice calmed me more than any words could. He spoke about work and his weekend plans, and I listened, more focused on his face than the content of his stories. There was a comforting ease in the air, a sense of normalcy that I clung to. I shifted into a more comfortable position, stretched my legs out, and let myself relax, as though the whole world had shrunk down to the screen in front of me. The soft glow of the desk lamp bathed the room in a cozy light, but a faint undercurrent of unease lingered in the background. Jake mentioned how much he missed me, and I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, a quiet desire to be closer, even just in thought. I leaned back, smiled, and let myself playfully toss my hair over my shoulder. My thoughts flowed freely, mingling with the faint music playing through the speakers. Then, the moment shattered. The door swung open suddenly like the crack of broken glass. I turned and froze. Paul stood in the doorway, His gaze was still and cold, as though he was assessing everything in the room, leaving no space for doubt. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick enough to muffle every other sound. Even the faint hum from my headphones seemed unbearably loud. I felt the heat rise to my face as my body locked into place. Paul slowly shut the door behind him, doing so with such deliberate quietness that the sound was almost imperceptible but felt like a blow. He took a few steps forward, his shadow stretching across the floor, reaching closer than the walls seemed to allow. Everything else faded away, the laptop with its frozen image, the dim light of the lamp. There was only him and the taut silence between us. Every movement felt measured, calculated, and I couldn't move. His presence occupied the entire room, as though he had sealed off every possible way out. I settled on the bed, propping myself up with a few pillows and wrapping my legs in a blanket. The video call with Jake began with familiar phrases full of warmth and a touch of sadness about the distance between us. His smile, slightly weary, was so familiar that I wanted to forget everything for just a moment. We talked about our days, laughed at old jokes, and revisited plans we hadn't managed to fulfill. "You know, I miss you," I confessed, covering my face with my hands in a playful attempt to hide the quiver in my voice. Jake laughed, his laughter so alive that for a second I felt free from the web of contradictions holding me captive. I stretched out my legs and shifted positions, leaning back into the pillows. My t-shirt lifted slightly, revealing a strip of skin along my stomach and thigh, but I paid no attention to it. The conversation became softer, more intimate. Jake joked, but his gaze held something genuine and tender. His words were simple, yet their simplicity made them feel real. "You could show me something special," he said with a half smile, his voice carrying a warmth that made my heart beat a little faster. I laughed, leaned back into the headboard, and allowed myself to be more at ease than usual. My thoughts about how I moved seemed irrelevant. I felt safe. But I didn't know someone was standing behind the door. Paul was watching through the slightly open door, his gaze heavy and unrelenting. He stood there without making a sound, but the tension from his presence seemed to fill the room like an invisible weight. I was unaware of anything. I laughed, adjusting the laptop so the camera captured more of the room. For Jake, it was a gesture of trust. For Paul, it was a reason to stay. For a moment, I thought the air in the room shifted, but I brushed it off as my own nervousness. At that moment, Paul quietly closed the door and took a few steps back. But as if surrendering to an inner struggle, he returned and stopped at the doorway, as though his decision wasn't final. The silence outside the door felt dense, as if someone had locked it along with unspoken words that no one dared to say aloud. The silence in the room shattered with the sharp click of the door. Paul entered swiftly but soundlessly like a shadow, yet there was a charged energy in his movements. I flinched, instinctively pulling the blanket higher, as if it could shield me from the inevitable. The laptop screen was still glowing. Jake's face was frozen in shock. His eyes widened in confusion, but he didn't say a word. He simply muted the microphone as though that could hide him. But reality had already broken apart. Paul stood in the middle of the room, filling the space with his presence. It felt as though even the air had thickened, becoming heavy with tension, vibrating with unspoken words. His gaze was locked on me, devoid of its usual calm. Instead, something else surfaced. Cold, demanding, almost accusatory. My heart pounded so loudly that the rush of blood in my ears drowned out everything else. I shut the laptop as if that could erase what he'd seen. But time couldn't be reversed, and every second stretched out endlessly. Paul didn't move. His hands hung at his sides, but his posture spoke of restrained power, a force barely held back. His silence was louder than any words could have been. I tried to gather my thoughts, but they scattered like dust in the wind. Everything felt surreal, as if I wasn't in my own room, but trapped in a confined space with no way out. Finally, Paul took a step forward. His movements were slow but unnervingly deliberate. It was as though he absorbed every inch of the room with his presence. "Reckless," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. But that one word cut deeper than a shout. A shiver ran through me. The cold steadiness of his voice burned more than any harsh phrase ever could. He took another step, erasing what little space remained between us. I felt his presence in every breath I took, pressing down on me like an unshakable weight. He stood close but didn't touch me. His gaze pierced through me, dismantling any wall I'd tried to build around myself. Paul's eyes flicked to the closed laptop before returning to mine. His face remained composed, but I could see the storm raging beneath the surface. "You're not just letting yourself down," he said slowly. "This affects all of us." His words, spoken so calmly, struck like a blow. His voice didn't rise, but the restraint in it held a fury far more intimidating than any outburst. I tried to speak, but my throat tightened. The air felt too thick to breathe. All I could manage was a shallow gasp, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Paul leaned closer, his face level with mine. It wasn't a gesture of aggression, it was a demand, one that left no room for avoidance. "You know there are consequences for this," he said, his voice soft but colder than ice. I tried to explain, but my voice came out weak, each word slipping out wrong. It wasn't what you think." He straightened but didn't step back. His breathing remained steady, but every breath felt like an echo in the confined room. His eyes seemed to demand something more than excuses or apologies. It was a feeling of complete helplessness, as if I'd lost control not just of the situation but of myself. I heard only his quiet voice. "You need to understand the consequences of your actions." The words weren't a threat, they were a promise. Something irreversible loomed over me. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I lifted my gaze and saw his eyes, calm yet unrelenting, impossible to ignore or resist. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving only this moment, a starting point after which nothing would ever be the same. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by distant sounds from outside. Paul sat on the edge of the bed, slowly, as if giving me time to understand what was happening. His posture seemed calm, but there was a tension beneath it, a force barely contained. His gaze held a mix of exhaustion, insistence, and something deeper that couldn't be easily deciphered. "You need to understand," he began quietly, but his voice trembled, caught between restraint and something unrestrained. I gripped the blanket tightly, trying not to show how much I was shaking inside. But his presence filled the space, erasing any semblance of distance. He reached out and traced his fingertips along my cheek, making my breath hitch. The touch was unexpectedly gentle, which only made it more terrifying and strangely magnetic. Paul's fingers slid down to my shoulder. His movements were slow, deliberate, but they carried the weight of something he could no longer control. I should have pulled away, stood up, shut this door forever. But instead I sat still, paralyzed by a mix of fear and longing. "You don't need to fear your feelings." His whisper was so close that it drowned out every other sound except the pounding of my heart. A wave of emotions surged inside me like a dam breaking. I tried to resist, but it was stronger than me. Every internal barrier I had carefully built crumbled all at once. His breath grew warmer as the space between us vanished. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the battle he was fighting within himself. My own hand lifted involuntarily, as if reaching out for a boundary that no longer existed. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to escape reality, but it only made everything sharper. Every breath, every sound felt amplified. Words froze on my lips, never spoken. I felt both vulnerable and free. There was something terrifying and irreversible in that contrast. Jake sat in front of the screen, unable to believe what he was seeing. His face was pale as chalk, his gaze hollow, as if he had lost the ability to think. Every sound he heard, every noise from Amelia felt foreign and unfamiliar. Her voice, her familiar voice, sounded different now, trembling, broken by emotions he had never heard before. It was as if she had become someone else. His hands shook as his fingers gripped the edges of the laptop, trying to hold on to reality. But the image before him was unbearable. The world seemed to slow down and show him the cruelest scene of his life. He watched everything they had built together shatter into tiny, irreparable pieces. The love, the trust, the quiet nights, they all vanished in an instant. Pain surged through him like a tidal wave, crushing everything inside. First came numbness, then rage, sharp and burning from within. Jake wanted to scream, to break something, but his body felt frozen by fury and betrayal. His chest tightened so much that he could barely breathe. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring the screen, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. With a sudden movement, he unmuted his microphone. His voice, usually warm and soft, was barely recognizable. Rough, broken, but cold and final. "Amelia, it's over between us. I've seen enough." Each word was like a hammer striking steel, leaving no room for repair. Jake didn't wait for her response. He ended the call, and the screen went dark. The room fell silent. Amelia sat motionless, her heart frozen, her mind refusing to accept reality. She turned to the laptop, but the screen was blank. Jake was gone. Gone was their familiar world, filled with the warmth of his voice, his care, his support, and his light. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the cold inside couldn't be soothed. The silence in the room thickened, filling every corner like a suffocating cloud. She felt that her world had completely collapsed. Along with it, the emotions she had tried to hold on to were gone, along with the part of herself that still believed it was possible to return to what they once had.